Jane Eyre has a counterattack heroine and the most miserable hero setting. When I first got the book Jane Eyre, my most intuitive feeling was that I was shocked by the thickness of the book. An autobiographical novel about a woman's independent growth actually has 520 pages. There are so many words in it. I know this will be a big project. According to chapters, I set a reading plan for myself, but when I started reading the first chapter, my plan was disrupted. In the end, I finished reading this large book in half the time I originally planned. When reading, the most profound feeling is that I want to let go but can't. I always want to finish reading this chapter before ending, but I always end up reading one chapter after another. No wonder after the author Charlotte Bronte mailed the manuscript to the publishing company, the company's partners read the book all night, and it was printed and published less than 2 months later. This is enough to prove the excellence of the work. The story is not only smooth and natural, but in each chapter, the author always skillfully places a suspense that is attractive enough to make people read curiously. I even thought it was a suspenseful and terrifying novel. In fact, Jane Eyre is an autobiographical novel. The heroine is called Jane Eyre. The story tells 3 experiences in her life, namely her tragic childhood experience, her love experience when she grew up, and her reunion with her family experience. Among them, the love affair with Mr. Rochester is the most attractive. Although Jane comes from a humble background, her character is tenacious and brave. In her pursuit of true love, she demanded equality and mutual love, and in the end Jane gained a happy love in life. In contrast, although the male protagonist Mr. Rochester was born noble and was originally a romantic young man, he had a secret life. When the truth was revealed, people could not help but sympathize with this young man. To people with completely different personalities, whether from birth or personality, fell in love. In the process of growing up, when they broke through the obstacles and got together, they also paid a heavy price. After Jane Eyre was published, it undoubtedly became a bestseller. While receiving recognition, it also encountered a lot of doubts. Among them, just the fact that the ordinary-looking private teacher fell in love with the wealthy male host is enough to make people criticize. But in fact, this is the author's uniqueness and brilliance. Jane Eyre is not only a female growth story. In the story, the author Charlotte uses the different fates and endings of the male and female protagonists to explain to readers the relationship of true equal love. First, in the counterattack life, Jane's independence and growth represent the dignity of women. Jane lost her parents when she was young and lived a life of dependence on others. She was often ruthlessly abused by her aunt, which made the young Jane eager to leave. After a conflict, Jane is sent to a strict boarding school. Although she encountered cold and hunger at school, Jane preferred to stay at school compared to her previous life at her aunt's house. After a severe plague, Jane survived and spent her childhood safely. In school, she received education and had her own thoughts and hobbies. As time went by, Jane began to yearn for life far away, and she voluntarily left school to start her own unknown life. She also met her true love, Mr. Rochester. After experiencing pain and trials, at the end of the story, Jane inherited a large inheritance from her relatives and lived happily with Mr. Rochester. As Jane grew up, she experienced the tests of life. Although suffering has always been with her, Jane's unyielding and kindness have been subtly helping her to avoid danger. It is inseparable from Jane's character that a female teacher, who was originally mediocre in appearance and had a miserable childhood, finally found happiness and had such a counterattack life. It can be said that inheritance is an important point for Jane to have an independent personality, and she is so lucky, which stems from her own kindness and destiny. When her aunt's old servant came to tell Jane about the misfortune at home, Jane did not rejoice, but chose to go back with the servant to defy her aunt's wish to see her. After returning to Mentefu, Jane still showed full patience and understanding when facing her aunt and her 2 cousins. This also allowed her aunt to tell Jane the information about her relatives who wanted to give her an inheritance before she died. This not only left an important foreshadowing for Jane's story, but also an important turning point in Jane's future life. And all this stems from Jane's kindness. Ian Gelling said this in Youth, A person who was never treated well by others can best recognize kindness and cherish kindness the most. Isn't this a portrayal of Jane? Jane has never been treated well by her relatives, but she knows how precious kindness is. So when her aunt was dying, she chose to treat her relatives kindly. In the end, this also allowed her to counterattack her miserable life and live an independent life. In the process of growing up, we must base ourselves on self-respect and self-love, and use kindness as our criterion. The growth we gain in the end is the invisible pillar of female dignity in life. Second, the most miserable male protagonist. Money cannot buy love. Only by giving sincerity can you gain true love. Compared with Jane's counterattack life, Mr. Rochester's life is more bumpy. When the secret truth of his life is revealed, he even has the feeling of being the most miserable male protagonist. Mr. Rochester's family is a prominent local family. When he was young, his father only wanted to give all the property to his brother. Not only did his father treat Mr. Rochester unfairly, he also found him a crazy wife. After Mr. Rochester knew that he had been deceived, he began a life of pain and indulgence. After his father and brother passed away one after another, Mr. Rochester lived a decent aristocratic life. But his crazy wife has always been an inescapable shadow in his heart. After meeting Jane, he fell in love with this stubborn girl. How to win this girl's heart? Although they are 20 years apart, Rochester still uses his interesting soul to win the beauty back. But Rochester's status as a married woman stands between them. In the end, he chose to hide it. When the secret is revealed, Jane leaves him. Jane left because of her own beliefs and her inner bottom line. Even if she loved someone else, Jane could not be a mistress with peace of mind. When Jane found Mr. Rochester again, he had undergone earth-shaking changes. He had lost his eyes and an arm. He was no longer a noble gentleman, but a down-and-out loser. It can be said that Rochester's life of high driving and low driving is the test of life from Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester was born noble, but there was no one who loved him in his upbringing. His father and brother pushed him into the abyss time and time again, and he experienced betrayal and deception. With scars all over his body, he traveled across the European continent just to find someone who truly loved him. Until he met Jane, he thought he could keep Jane with money and a good life. But money and lies did not make Jane stay. Instead, Jane returned to him when he had nothing, not even a complete body. Because in the fire, Mr. Rochester showed his bravery and responsibility. He did not run away or give up on anyone. Although he lost his health, he finally gained the right to true love. This is lucky for him, because true love is what he is willing to give up everything to pursue. The tests of life are always everywhere. Only when you give your sincerity, your wishes will naturally come true. Third, a truly equal relationship is a dual balance of externality and internality. At the end of the story, the counterattacking Jane and the miserable Mr. Rochester live happily together. A happy ending with the tragic price Mr. Rochester paid. Although it is a bit cruel to Mr. Rochester, this ending is the best arrangement. If when Jane returns to Mr. Rochester, he is still rich, noble, and interesting, and he still locks up his crazy wife, can Jane and Mr. Rochester be happy? The answer is obviously no, because they are not equal. They have no legal status. Mr. Rochester is still the proud master, and although Jane is financially independent, she still cannot compete with her former master. Such a relationship is unfair. Only when the tragic Jane has relatives who love her and the money to make herself independent, while Mr. Rochester has lost his ex-wife and is alone, and that noble and proud soul is no longer always aloof. Will they be truly equal? It is a relationship of equality from the inner soul to the outer status. In fact, the issue of gender equality has been discussed since ancient times, and the author's answers can be found in literary works of various periods. The ending of the story in Jane Eyre is the equality that the author deliberately wanted to express. In Charlotte's era, women were always dependent on men, and wanting to join the aristocratic world was the expectation of most women and their families, which often ignored women's desire for freedom and equality. In the book, Jane is the embodiment of every woman who looks forward to freedom and equality. Although Jane Eyre has been controversial since its publication, it is undeniable that it inspired the longing for freedom and equality buried in women's hearts with its enlightening attitude. It is like an awakening light that shines into the lives of countless confused women, giving them meaning and direction. And this is also a good literary work, which should awaken and inspire readers.